The winter wind howled against the weathered boards of the farmhouse, rattling the windows like an unwelcome visitor demanding entry. Josephine Jackson shivered, pulling her woolen shawl tighter around her shoulders as she stared out at the expansive Montana prairie that surrounded her homestead. The first snow of 1875 had fallen the night before, dusting the rolling grasslands with a thin layer of white that sparkled beneath the morning sun. Beautiful but terrifying when you faced it alone. Another winter, she whispered to herself, her breath fogging the glass. At 32, she hadn't imagined she'd be a widow with a farm to manage and dwindling supplies. When Thomas had died from pneumonia last spring, she'd somehow made it through the planting, the growing, and the harvest. But winter was different. Winter was merciless. The small barn needed repairs, the livestock needed feed, and her woodpile wasn't nearly high enough to withstand the harsh Montana months ahead. The nearest town, Colfax, was 15 miles away, too far to travel regularly once the snow piled high. Josephine pressed her palm against the cool glass and forced back tears. She wouldn't cry. Crying wouldn't stack firewood or fix the roof. A movement in the distance caught her attention. A rider, making his way steadily toward her homestead. Josephine squinted, her heart quickening with both hope and trepidation. Visitors were rare, especially as winter approached. She reached for her husband's rifle, kept loaded by the door, a precaution she'd never needed but maintained nonetheless. As the rider drew closer, she could make out the broad-shouldered silhouette of a man and the shape of a wagon behind his horse. The sun glinted off something in the wagon bed hay bales, she realized with surprise. Hay that she desperately needed for her 2 milk cows and aging mare. Josephine stepped onto her porch, rifle held casually but ready, and watched as the stranger approached. He rode tall in the saddle, his face shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat. As he neared the yard, he slowed his horse and raised a hand in greeting. "Good morning, madam," he called, his voice carrying across the clear winter air. "Owen Keller, from the Diamond K Ranch. Mr. Peterson in town mentioned you might be needing some hay before the passes get snowed in." Josephine lowered her rifle slightly but maintained her position on the porch. "Mr. Peterson sent you?" The man nodded, pulling his horse to a stop a respectful distance from her steps. "Yes, madam. Said your husband passed last spring and you might appreciate some help before winter sets in proper." He gestured to the wagon behind him. "I've brought 10 bales to start, figured it might see you through until the new year at least." Josephine studied him carefully. He appeared to be in his late 30s, with weathered skin that spoke of years under the sun. His clothes were worn but clean, and there was something open about his face that put her slightly at ease. "That's mighty kind," she said cautiously. "But I don't take charity, Mr. Keller." A small smile touched his lips as he dismounted. "No charity intended, Mrs. Jackson. I'm proposing a trade. I understand you make the finest apple preserves in the county. I've got a sweet tooth that would appreciate a few jars, if you're willing." The mention of her preserves, something Thomas had always praised, brought an unexpected warmth to her cheeks. "How do you know about my preserves?" "Small county, big stories," he said, removing his hat. His hair was the color of dark honey, streaked with strands of silver at the temples. And Mr. Peterson was quite descriptive about how they taste like sunshine in a jar. Despite herself, Josephine felt a smile tug at her lips. "He's exaggerating." "I'd like to judge for myself, if you don't mind." Owen gestured to the wagon. "May I unload these in your barn? Looks like the sky's threatening more snow." Josephine glanced up at the gathering clouds and nodded. She set the rifle down inside the door and stepped off the porch. "I'll help you." "No need," Owen said, already moving toward the wagon. "Just point me to where you want them stacked." For the next hour, Josephine watched as Owen efficiently unloaded the hay bales, stacking them neatly in her barn. He worked methodically, his movements sure and practiced. When he finished, he took a moment to examine the barn roof, pointing out a few spots where repairs were needed. "These boards here won't last the winter," he said, gesturing to a section near the corner. "First heavy snow will push right through, Josephine sighed. I know, I've been meaning to fix it, but I could do it for you, he offered casually, dusting hay from his sleeves. Got some extra lumber at my place. Wouldn't take more than an afternoon. Suspicion flickered through her. And what would you want in exchange for that, Mr. Keller? He looked at her directly, his eyes a clear blue that reminded her of summer skies. Supper, perhaps. Been eating my own cooking for too long, and I hear you're as skilled with a stove as you are with preserves. The request was simple enough, and her instincts told her this man meant no harm. Still, she'd learned to be cautious. You'd work all afternoon for a single meal? Owen shrugged. Good company is worth more than lumber, Mrs. Jackson. Besides, winter's long out here. Neighborly connections make it shorter. Josephine considered his words. The truth was, she did need help, and the thought of having someone to talk to, even for an evening, held more appeal than she wanted to admit. All right, Mr. Keller, you fix my roof and I'll fix you supper. His smile reached his eyes this time. Deal. I'll be back tomorrow with the lumber if that suits you, Josephine nodded. Tomorrow's fine. As promised, Owen returned the next day with a wagon load of lumber and tools. The day was clear but cold, the kind of sharp cold that made her lungs ache when she breathed deeply. She watched from the kitchen window as he worked on the barn roof, moving with an efficiency that spoke of years of such labor. By mid-afternoon, she'd prepared a hearty stew and fresh bread, the aromas filling the small house. When Owen finally came in, his cheeks ruddy from the cold, she had the table set with her best dishes, the ones that rarely saw use anymore. Smells like heaven in here, he said, hanging his coat and hat by the door. He'd clearly made an effort to clean up, his hair damp at the edges where he'd washed his face, his hands scrubbed pink. It's just venison stew, she replied, suddenly self-conscious about the simple meal. Owen took his seat at her invitation and looked appreciatively at the spread before him. Nothing just about a home-cooked meal, Mrs. Jackson. As they ate, conversation came more easily than Josephine had expected. Owen spoke of his ranch, a modest spread about 20 miles west of her homestead. He'd come to Montana Territory 15 years earlier, drawn by the promise of open land and a fresh start. Lost my wife to cholera back in Pennsylvania, he shared quietly. Figured the mountains might give me room to breathe again. Josephine's heart softened at this revelation. I'm sorry for your loss. Owen nodded his acknowledgement. It was a long time ago now, and you, how long have you been in Colfax County? 4 years, she replied. Thomas and I came from Illinois. He had dreams of building something of our own away from his family's farm. She glanced around the small but tidy home they'd built together. He worked so hard to make this place viable, I wish he could have enjoyed it longer. Owen's expression was one of understanding, not pity, and Josephine appreciated the difference. He chose well, Owen said. This is good land. With the right care, it'll provide for generations. If I can keep it, she admitted, the bank's been patient so far, but without Thomas's strength. A woman's strength is different but no less powerful, Owen said matter-of-factly. And you strike me as someone who doesn't give up easily. Josephine smiled despite herself. My mother always said I was stubborn as a mule. Good quality in a homesteader, Owen chuckled, accepting a second helping of stew. This is delicious, by the way, best meal I've had in years. After supper, Owen insisted on helping with the dishes, and they stood side by side at her small sink, their hands occasionally brushing in the warm, soapy water. Each accidental touch sent an unexpected flutter through Josephine's chest, a sensation she hadn't felt since her early days with Thomas. As Owen prepared to leave, the sun already setting behind the mountains, he paused at the door. I noticed your woodpiles running low, he said. I could bring some logs when I come back to finish the barn door. Josephine raised an eyebrow. The barn door seems fine to me. Owen's eyes crinkled at the corners. Hinges are rusting, won't last the winter, I can replace them. Say day after tomorrow, she knew what he was doing, creating reasons to return, and surprisingly she found she didn't mind. The day had been pleasant, more than pleasant, and the prospect of facing the entire winter without another conversation like this one suddenly seemed bleak. "Day after tomorrow, then," she agreed. "I'll have those preserves ready for you to take home." His smile was warm. "Looking forward to it, Mrs. Jackson." "Josephine," she said impulsively, "if you're going to be fixing things around my farm, you might as well use my name." He nodded, something soft passing across his features. "Josephine," he repeated as if testing the feel of it. "Good night then, Josephine." "Sleep well." As she watched him ride away, a strange mixture of emotions swirled within her. Guilt for the warmth she'd felt in his company, hope for the prospect of his return, and fear not of Owen himself, but of what his presence in her life might mean for the careful walls she'd built around her heart since Thomas's death. The next day passed with excruciating slowness. Josephine found herself glancing repeatedly toward the road, even though she knew Owen wouldn't return until the following day. She busied herself with chores, cleaning areas of the house that hadn't seen attention in months, and selecting her best apples for a pie. When she caught herself considering which dress to wear, Josephine stopped short, shocked at her own behavior. "This is ridiculous," she muttered to herself. "He's just being neighborly, nothing more." Yet when Owen appeared the next morning, earlier than expected, and with not only lumber but a fresh deer haunch slung over his saddle, Josephine couldn't deny the leap of pleasure she felt at the sight of him. "Thought you might appreciate some fresh meat," he said by way of greeting. "Got lucky at dawn." The gesture touched her deeply. Game had been scarce lately, and she'd been conserving her supplies carefully. "That's very thoughtful, thank you." Their day fell into an unexpected rhythm. While Owen worked on the barn door, Josephine prepared the venison, occasionally stepping outside to check his progress or bring him water. They spoke in comfortable exchanges, sharing stories of their pasts and observations about the changing weather. By late afternoon, Owen had not only fixed the door but also reinforced a weak section of fencing and chopped enough firewood to significantly increase her pile. When he finally came inside for supper, the easy companionship between them felt natural, as if they'd known each other for years rather than days. Over venison steaks and roasted potatoes, Owen mentioned the upcoming winter festival in Colfax. "Town does it every year before the heavy snows make travel difficult," he explained. "Music, dancing, folks trading goods before settling in for winter. It's happening this Saturday." Josephine nodded. "Thomas and I went the first year we arrived, haven't been since." Owen set down his fork. "Would you consider going this year?" "With me?" The directness of the question surprised her. "You're asking to escort me to the festival?" "I am," he confirmed, his gaze steady. "As neighbors or friends, however you're comfortable seeing it." Josephine felt a blush rise to her cheeks. The proper thing would be to decline. She was still in mourning, technically, though the most formal period had passed. Yet the thought of an evening of music and company before the isolation of winter was undeniably appealing. I would like that," she said finally. "As friends." Owen's smile was worth any impropriety the town gossips might perceive. "I'll come by around noon on Saturday then. The roads might be slow going if it snows again." After he left that evening, with 3 jars of her preserves and the promise to return in 3 days, Josephine sat alone by her fire and allowed herself to acknowledge the truth. Owen Keller had awakened something in her that she'd thought had died with Thomas. Not love, it was far too soon for that, but possibility. The sense that her life might still hold surprises and joy, the days until Saturday crawled by. Josephine found herself rummaging through her trunk for her best dress, a deep blue wool that she hadn't worn since Thomas's funeral. She washed and pressed it, then spent an hour working her hair into a style more elaborate than the practical bun she'd worn for months. When Owen arrived, right at noon as promised, he looked different too. His usual work clothes had been replaced by a clean shirt, vest, and what appeared to be newly polished boots. He'd trimmed his beard and slicked back his hair, and the effect was striking enough that Josephine felt her breath catch. "You look beautiful," he said simply when she opened the door. "Thank you," she replied, suddenly shy. "You clean up rather well yourself." The ride to Colfax was filled with comfortable conversation and occasional comfortable silences. Owen pointed out landmarks and shared stories about the area's history, making the journey pass quickly despite the cold. As they approached the town, Josephine could see decorations adorning the main street, evergreen boughs and red ribbons brightening the wooden storefronts. The festival was already underway when they arrived. Music spilled from the town hall and tables lined the street, laden with goods for trade and sale. People moved about in their winter finery, greeting one another with the special warmth that comes from shared community. Josephine felt a moment of anxiety as heads turned their way. She hadn't been to town in months, and arriving with Owen would certainly start tongues wagging. But his steadying presence beside her gave her courage, and she lifted her chin as they made their way through the crowd. Mr. Peterson, the general store owner, was the first to approach them. "Mrs. Jackson, wonderful to see you in town." His gaze shifted to Owen, a knowing smile crossing his face. "I see you two have gotten acquainted." "Thanks to your suggestion, sir," Owen replied easily. "Mrs. Jackson's been kind enough to tolerate my company in exchange for some work around her farm." Peterson nodded approvingly. "Good, good. She's needed a helping hand since Thomas passed. Too proud to ask, though." Josephine felt her cheeks warm. "I manage just fine, Mr. Peterson." "Of course you do," the older man agreed quickly. "But even the strongest among us need neighbors, especially with winter coming on hard this year." He patted Owen's shoulder. "You picked a good one to befriend, Keller. Her husband was one of the finest men I knew." "I've heard nothing but good things about him," Owen said respectfully. As they continued through the festival, Josephine was touched by the genuine welcome she received. Neighbors she hadn't seen in months greeted her warmly, several women inviting her to join their quilting circle once the roads cleared in spring. "People care about you," Owen observed as they sampled cider from the cooper's stand. "I've kept to myself since Thomas died," she admitted. "Perhaps too much." Owen's hand found hers briefly, a gentle pressure that was gone almost as soon as it appeared. Grief needs space. But there comes a time when space becomes isolation. The wisdom in his words struck her. Had she been hiding rather than healing? Using her work on the farm as an excuse to avoid facing a world without Thomas? Before she could dwell on these thoughts, the music from the town hall changed to a lively reel, and Owen's eyes lit up. "Would you care to dance, Josephine?" The question hovered between them, weighted with meaning beyond a simple dance. To accept was to publicly step back into life, to acknowledge that while she would always honor Thomas's memory, she was still living. "Yes," she said, surprised by the steadiness in her voice. "I would like that very much." Owen led her to the crowded dance floor where couples were already forming lines for the reel. They took their places, and when the music began in earnest, Josephine found herself swept into movement. Owen was a surprisingly graceful dancer, guiding her through the steps with confidence. As they turned and stepped in time to the fiddles, Josephine felt something long dormant unfurl within her, joy, pure and simple. She laughed as Owen spun her, her skirts swirling around her ankles, her hand warm in his. For those moments, the weight of her responsibilities, her grief, and her fears lifted completely. They danced for hours, moving from reels to waltzes, stopping only occasionally for refreshments. Josephine couldn't remember the last time she'd enjoyed herself so thoroughly. When they finally stepped outside for air, the winter night had fully descended, stars pricking the black sky above. "Thank you," she said softly. "I'd forgotten how much I enjoy dancing." Owen smiled down at her, his face illuminated by the lanterns strung along the street. "You're a natural." "I was just trying to keep up." Josephine laughed, the sound startling in its lightness. "Hardly, but it felt good to be part of things again." "You were missed," Owen said. "I could see it in the way people welcomed you back." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching their breath mist in the cold air. Owen's arm brushed against hers and neither moved away from the contact. "We should start back soon," Josephine said reluctantly. "The temperature's dropping." Owen nodded. "Just one more thing before we go." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small package wrapped in brown paper. "I saw this earlier and thought of you." Surprised, Josephine accepted the gift. Unwrapping it carefully, she revealed a small book of poetry, its leather cover worn but well preserved. "Emily Dickinson," she read, running her fingers over the embossed title. "How did you know I enjoy poetry?" Owen looked pleased by her reaction. "I noticed a volume on your shelf when I was there. Thought you might appreciate some new verses to read during the long winter evenings." The thoughtfulness of the gift touched her deeply. "This is lovely, thank you." The ride home was quieter than their journey to town, but the silence was comfortable, filled with shared contentment rather than awkwardness. Josephine found herself leaning slightly against Owen's solid presence as the wagon swayed along the rutted road, the stars bright above them. When they reached her homestead, Owen insisted on seeing her safely inside and lighting her lamps before taking his leave. At the door, he paused, his hat in his hands. "Would it be too forward to ask if I might call on you again?" he asked, his usual confidence tempered with a hint of uncertainty. Josephine's heart quickened. "No, it wouldn't be too forward. I would welcome your company." Relief and pleasure crossed his features. "How about Sunday, after church? I could bring some more firewood, help you prepare for that storm they're predicting." "That would be nice," she agreed. Then impulsively she added, "Stay for supper again. I'll make apple pie." Owen's smile was warm. "I'd like nothing better." After he left, Josephine stood by her window, watching until his wagon disappeared into the darkness. Only then did she allow herself to acknowledge what was happening. She was beginning to care for Owen Keller. The realization didn't bring the guilt she might have expected, but rather a gentle warmth, as if Thomas himself might understand her heart's tentative reawakening. The next morning dawned clear but bitterly cold. Josephine went about her chores with renewed energy, humming as she fed the chickens and milked the cows. The book Owen had given her sat on her bedside table, several pages already turned down at poems that had particularly moved her. Saturday passed in a flurry of baking and cleaning. Josephine made a point of attending church on Sunday morning, something she'd neglected in recent months. The small white clapboard building was packed with families seeking warmth, both spiritual and physical, and she received several more invitations to social gatherings. When Owen arrived that afternoon, his wagon loaded with split logs, Josephine's welcome was genuine and warm. They worked together to stack the wood along the side of her house, their conversation flowing easily. When Owen mentioned a broken fence line on the far side of her property, Josephine didn't hesitate to accept his offer to repair it the following week. "You can't keep working for just meals," she protested as they sat down to supper. "I'm going to be indebted to you at this rate." Owen's eyes met hers across the table. "I don't keep score, Josephine. I enjoy helping you and I enjoy your company even more." His honesty disarmed her. "Still, there must be something I can do in return." Owen seemed to consider this. "Well, I did notice your skill with a needle when I saw that quilt on your bed." He hesitated. "My shirts could use some mending if you're willing. I'm all thumbs with delicate work like that." Josephine nodded, relieved to have some way to reciprocate his kindness. "Bring them next time you come. I'd be happy to help." As promised, Owen returned the following week with both fence supplies and a bundle of shirts needing attention. The day was brutally cold, with a wind that cut through layers of clothing. But Owen worked steadily on the fence line while Josephine sat by her fire, meticulously repairing his worn garments. When he finally came in, his face raw from the wind, Josephine insisted he sit by the fire while she prepared hot coffee laced with whiskey to warm him. "You shouldn't have stayed out so long," she scolded gently, pressing the steaming mug into his hands. "The fence could have waited for milder weather." Owen shook his head. "Storms coming, needed to be done before your cattle found that gap." He sipped the coffee gratefully. Besides, knew I had this warmth to look forward to. Something in his tone made Josephine glance up from the stew she was stirring. His eyes held hers with an intensity that sent heat rising to her cheeks. Neither spoke for a moment, the crackle of the fire the only sound in the small kitchen. "I've finished mending your shirts," she said finally, breaking the charged silence. "There's one with a tear along the shoulder seam that needed more substantial repair. I'll have it done by the time you leave." Owen nodded, his gaze still warm. "Thank you, you have a gift with a needle." They ate supper by lamplight, the early winter darkness having fallen hours before. Outside, the wind grew stronger, rattling the windows and sending occasional drafts through the small house, despite Josephine's best efforts at weatherproofing. As Owen prepared to leave, he paused at the door, listening to the howl of the wind. "That storm's moved in faster than I expected," he said, frowning. "It's not safe to travel in this. Roads will be drifted over already." Josephine joined him at the door, peering out at the swirling snow that had indeed begun to fall heavily. "You can't go out in that," she agreed, concern evident in her voice. "You'd never find your way home in such conditions." Their eyes met, both realizing the implication of her words. Propriety dictated that a single man shouldn't stay the night in a widow's home, but the alternative was risking his life in a blizzard. "I can sleep in the barn," Owen suggested, though they both knew the unheated structure would offer little protection from the brutal cold. Josephine shook her head firmly. "Don't be ridiculous. You'd freeze to death. You'll stay in the house. I have a spare room. It was meant to be a nursery, but—" She trailed off, old pain briefly crossing her features. "There's a cot in there. It's not much, but it's warm." Relief mingled with something deeper in Owen's expression. "If you're sure it's proper." "Proper would be not having your death on my conscience," she replied pragmatically, though her heart was beating faster than the situation warranted. "Besides, no one need know you stayed." Owen helped her secure the house against the storm, checking windows and doors to ensure no snow would find its way inside during the night. The domesticity of the task wasn't lost on either of them, this sharing of home duties that normally fell to a husband and wife. When it came time to retire, Josephine showed Owen to the small room off the main bedroom. It was sparsely furnished with just the cot, a small table, and a chest that held linens. She provided him with extra blankets and a candle. "If you need anything in the night, don't hesitate to call out," she said, hovering in the doorway. "The stove will keep the house warm, but this room can get drafty." Owen nodded, their proximity in the narrow doorway making her acutely aware of his height and strength. "I'll be fine." "Thank you for your hospitality." "Good night, then," she said softly, reluctant to leave yet knowing she must. "Good night, Josephine," he replied, his voice equally quiet. "Sleep well." In her own room, Josephine changed into her nightgown and lay beneath her quilt, listening to the storm rage outside and the occasional creak of floorboards as Owen settled in the next room. The knowledge that he was just beyond her wall, the first man to sleep under her roof since Thomas, filled her with a complex mixture of emotions. She didn't expect to sleep, but exhaustion from the day's work eventually pulled her under. She dreamed of summer meadows and dancing, of strong hands holding hers and blue eyes that saw straight to her soul. When she woke, the storm had passed, leaving a world transformed by white. Sunlight streamed through her window, reflecting off the snow with blinding brilliance. For a moment, she lay still, savoring the warmth of her bed before the day's chores would demand her attention. Then she smelled coffee and heard the quiet sounds of movement in her kitchen. Dressing quickly, Josephine found Owen stoking her stove, a pot of coffee already brewing and the fixings for breakfast laid out on her table. "Hope you don't mind," he said when he noticed her. "Thought I'd make myself useful while you slept." The sight of him in her kitchen, comfortable and domestic, stirred something deep within her. "Not at all, thank you." They breakfasted together, discussing the storm's impact and the likely state of the roads. Outside, the snow had drifted higher than Owen's knees in places. "It'll be slow going, but I should be able to make it back," Owen said, looking out at the transformed landscape. My horses are strong, and the sun will help clear the main road. Josephine nodded, trying to hide her disappointment that he would leave so soon. You're welcome to wait until it melts down a bit. Owen turned to her, his expression serious. If I stay longer, people might talk. I don't want to compromise your reputation. My reputation, she echoed with a small smile. I suppose you're right. He moved closer, his gaze intent. Josephine, I've enjoyed these past weeks more than I can say. Your company has brought something into my life that I thought I'd never find again. Her heart quickened at his words. I've felt the same, she admitted quietly. Owen's hand reached for hers, his touch gentle but sure. Then maybe I could call on you properly, not just to help around the farm, but as a suitor, if it's not too soon after your loss. The directness of his question took her breath away. Was it too soon? Thomas had been gone for over 8 months now. The most intense period of her grief had passed, leaving a gentle ache rather than the sharp pain of fresh loss. I would like that, she said finally, her voice steadier than she felt. Very much. The smile that spread across Owen's face was like sunrise. You've made me a happy man, Josephine Jackson. He left an hour later, promising to return within days if the roads allowed. Josephine watched him go, a mixture of anticipation and uncertainty swirling within her. She was stepping into unknown territory, beginning something new, while still honoring what had come before. True to his word, Owen returned 3 days later, this time with a small bouquet of pine branches and dried berries, the only things he could find in the winter landscape, but arranged with obvious care. Josephine placed them in a vase on her table, touched by the gesture. Over the next month, a pattern emerged. Owen would visit every few days, sometimes helping with chores or repairs, sometimes simply bringing supplies or news from town. They would share meals, talk late into the evening, and gradually, the distance between them lessened. The first time he kissed her was on Christmas Eve. He'd brought a small tree for her parlor and helped her decorate it with paper stars and ribbons. As they stood admiring their handiwork in the glow of candlelight, Owen had turned to her, his expression solemn yet tender. I've been wanting to do this for weeks, he murmured, his hand coming up to gently cup her cheek. Josephine leaned into his touch. What stopped you? Respect, patience. His thumb traced the curve of her cheekbone. Fear that you might not welcome it. I would welcome it, she whispered. His lips met hers softly at first, a question rather than a demand. When she responded, her hands coming up to rest on his chest, the kiss deepened, becoming a conversation of its own. It was different from Thomas's kisses, not better or worse, just different, and in that moment, Josephine realized that loving again didn't diminish what she'd had before. It simply added new chapters to her story. When they parted, Owen rested his forehead against hers. I'm falling in love with you, Josephine. I think I have been since that first day when you stood on your porch with a rifle, looking like you'd use it if necessary. A laugh bubbled up from somewhere deep inside her. Not the most romantic first impression. On the contrary, he smiled. Your strength was the first thing I admired about you, still is. January brought the deepest cold of the winter. Owen took to staying overnight more frequently, the dangerous conditions making travel between their properties treacherous. To preserve Josephine's reputation, he always brought work as his excuse, helping to berth calves, repair equipment, or reinforce structures against the weight of snow. The town, however, was not fooled. When Josephine ventured into Colfax for supplies in late January, taking advantage of a brief thaw, she felt the speculative glances and heard the whispered conversations. She held her head high, refusing to be shamed for finding happiness. Mrs. Baker, the minister's wife, approached her directly as she was selecting fabric in the general store. Mrs. Jackson, she said, her voice pitched low, I feel it's my Christian duty to mention that there has been talk about Mr. Keller's frequent visits to your property. Josephine continued examining the bolt of calico. Has there? How interesting that people have so little to occupy their minds during winter, Mrs. Baker pressed her lips together. Your husband hasn't been gone a year. There are proprieties to consider. At this, Josephine set down the fabric and faced the woman directly. Mrs. Baker, I appreciated the casseroles your circle brought after Thomas died. I appreciated the prayers and the sympathy. But Thomas would not want me to live the rest of my life alone, especially not to satisfy the town's sense of proper mourning periods. The older woman's eyes widened at her directness. Well, Mr. Keller has been a friend and neighbor when I needed one most, Josephine continued firmly. Whatever develops between us is our business, not the town's. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to finish my shopping before the weather turns again. She turned her back on the woman's stunned expression, her heart pounding but her resolve firm. When she recounted the encounter to Owen that evening, he laughed appreciatively. I wish I could have seen Mrs. Baker's face, he said, his eyes twinkling. Though I'm sorry you had to face that alone. Josephine shrugged, cutting slices of bread to go with their stew. I'm not ashamed of our friendship, Owen, or whatever it's becoming. His expression grew serious. What is it becoming, Josephine? For me, it's already something I treasure more than anything. She set down her knife, meeting his gaze across the table. For me as well, I never expected to find this again, this feeling. After Thomas died, I thought that part of my life was over. Owen moved around the table to stand before her, taking her hands in his. And now I find myself looking forward rather than back, she admitted. Thinking of possibilities rather than just survival. He lifted her hands to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles. I want to be part of those possibilities, Josephine, part of your future if you'll have me. The question hung between them, not quite a proposal but moving steadily in that direction. Josephine felt herself at the edge of a precipice, ready to leap if only she could be sure of what awaited her below. I need time, she said honestly. Not because I doubt my feelings for you, but because I want to be certain I'm moving forward for the right reasons, not just fear of facing another winter alone. Owen nodded, understanding in his eyes. I've waited this long. I can wait until you're ready. February brought more storms and more shared evenings by the fire. They read to each other from Josephine's books, played cards, and talked of their pasts and dreams for the future. Owen spoke of his plans to expand his cattle operation, while Josephine shared her hope of planting an orchard come spring. One evening, as they sat side by side on her small sofa, Owen's arm around her shoulders, Josephine found the courage to ask the question that had been on her mind. Why didn't you remarry after your wife died? It's been 15 years, you said. Owen was quiet for a moment, his fingers absently stroking her arm. I suppose I never found anyone who made me want to risk my heart again, until now. The simple honesty of his answer moved her deeply. And now you're willing to risk it, he turned to face her, his eyes reflecting the firelight. Some things are worth the risk, Josephine. You are worth the risk. Their kiss that night was deeper, more urgent than those that had come before. When Owen finally pulled away, his breathing uneven, Josephine knew that they were approaching a line that, once crossed, would change everything between them. I should go, he said reluctantly, though they both knew the heavy snow outside made that impossible. To my room, I mean. Josephine nodded, equally reluctant yet knowing he was right. They weren't yet husband and wife, whatever their hearts might feel. The next morning, Owen announced that he needed to return to his ranch for several days to tend to business that couldn't be delayed any longer. The separation, their first extended time apart since their relationship had begun, was difficult for them both. I'll be back as soon as I can, he promised as he prepared to leave. A week at most, Josephine nodded, trying to hide her disappointment. I've managed on my own before, I'll be fine. Owen pulled her into his arms, kissing her with a thoroughness that left her breathless. I know you'll be fine. It's me I'm worried about. I've grown accustomed to your company, Josephine Jackson. The week of his absence stretched interminably. Josephine threw herself into work around the farm, preparing for the spring planting and tending to her animals with extra care. Each night, she read from the book of poetry Owen had given her, finding comfort in the words and in knowing he would soon return. On the 6th day, just as dusk was falling, she heard the familiar sound of a wagon approaching. Rushing to the door, she watched as Owen's tall figure emerged from the growing darkness, leading his team of horses up her drive. She didn't wait for him to reach the porch but ran out to meet him, heedless of the cold or the mud that splashed her skirts. Owen caught her in his arms, swinging her around once before setting her down and kissing her soundly. "I missed you," she said when they parted, slightly embarrassed by her impulsive greeting. "Not half as much as I missed you," he replied, his smile warming her more effectively than any fire. That evening, as they sat at her table sharing the meal she'd prepared in anticipation of his return, Owen seemed unusually serious. He kept reaching into his pocket as if checking for something, and his responses to her questions about his ranch were distracted. Finally, Josephine set down her fork. "Owen, what is it? You've been fidgeting all evening." He looked up, a flash of guilt crossing his features. "That obvious, am I?" "Completely," she confirmed. "Is something wrong at your ranch?" "No, nothing's wrong." He took a deep breath, then pushed back his chair and, to Josephine's astonishment, knelt beside her at the table. "In fact, everything is more right than it's been in years." From his pocket, he withdrew a small wooden box, its surface polished smooth and inlaid with a delicate pattern of wildflowers. "I made this for you," he said, offering it to her with slightly unsteady hands. Josephine accepted it, her own hands trembling as she opened the hinged lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of soft cloth, was a ring, a simple gold band set with a small but perfect sapphire. "It was my mother's," Owen explained, his voice low with emotion. "I've kept it all these years waiting for you, though I didn't know it then." Josephine lifted her gaze from the ring to his earnest face. "Owen, Josephine Jackson, I love you," he said simply. "I love your strength and your kindness. I love how you face each day with determination, how you've created beauty in this harsh place. I love the way you laugh and how you're not afraid to speak your mind." He paused, taking her hand in his. "I know it hasn't been a year since Thomas passed, and if you need more time, I understand. But I want you to know that whenever you're ready, I want to make a life with you. Will you marry me?" Tears blurred Josephine's vision as she looked at this man who had brought light back into her world. The answer came from her heart, clear and certain. "Yes, yes, I'll marry you, Owen." His smile was radiant as he slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her all along. Owen rose to his feet, pulling her up with him and into his arms. "You've made me the happiest man in Montana territory," he murmured against her hair. How soon can you be ready?" Josephine laughed at his eagerness. "Spring," she suggested. "When the snow melts and the world is new again, it seems fitting." Owen nodded, though she could feel his reluctance to wait even that long. "Spring it is, though it'll be the longest winter of my life, knowing what awaits at its end." They agreed to marry in early April, as soon as the roads were passable enough for guests to travel. The news of their engagement spread quickly through Colfax County, met with a mixture of approval and gossip. Most people were genuinely happy for them, particularly those who had worried about Josephine facing another winter alone. The remaining weeks of winter passed in a flurry of preparations. Owen divided his time between his ranch and Josephine's farm, making improvements to her property while also readying his own home for her arrival after their wedding. They decided that Josephine would move to his larger ranch house, but they would maintain her farmstead as well, perhaps hiring help once they were settled. As March brought the first tentative signs of thaw, Josephine found herself sorting through her possessions, deciding what to take to her new home and what to leave behind. It was a bittersweet task, especially when she came to Thomas's belongings, which she had left largely untouched since his death. Owen found her one afternoon, sitting amidst boxes in her bedroom, holding one of Thomas's shirts in her hands, tears streaming silently down her face. "Josephine," he said gently, kneeling beside her. "What is it?" She looked up, not bothering to wipe away her tears. I'm sorry, I was just remembering. It feels strange, packing up our life together to start a new one. Owen sat beside her, his arm going around her shoulders. You don't have to apologize for loving him. I'd never expect you to forget Thomas or what you shared. Josephine leaned into his strength. I know, and that's one of the reasons I love you so much. You understand that my heart is big enough for both memories and new beginnings. Owen pressed a kiss to her temple. Take all the time you need with this, and know that anything of Thomas's that you want to keep, there's room for in our home. His understanding only deepened her love for him. This man, who had come into her life when she least expected it, had shown her that love wasn't a finite resource that could be used up, but rather an expanding force that grew with sharing. Their wedding day dawned clear and mild, the April sun warming the earth enough to bring forth the first green shoots of new growth. They chose to marry in the small church in Colfax, with the entire community invited to witness their union. Josephine wore a dress of pale blue silk that Mrs. Peterson had helped her make, with lace at the collar and cuffs that had once adorned her mother's wedding gown. Owen, resplendent in a new black suit, waited for her at the altar with an expression of such joy that it brought tears to the eyes of even the most stoic townspeople. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Owen's kiss was tender yet passionate, a promise of the life they would build together. The celebration afterward lasted well into the evening, with music and dancing and enough food to feed the county twice over. As twilight fell, they slipped away from the festivities, driving back to Owen's ranch, now their ranch, in comfortable silence, their hands entwined between them on the wagon seat. Welcome home, Mrs. Keller, Owen said as he carried her across the threshold of the sturdy ranch house. Josephine looked around at the home that would now be hers as well. Owen had prepared for her arrival with touching attention to detail. Fresh curtains hung at the windows, a vase of early wildflowers stood on the table, and a new quilt clearly purchased in town adorned the large bed in the main bedroom. It's perfect, she said, meaning it. Though different from her small farmhouse, the ranch already felt like a place she could belong. That night, as they came together as husband and wife for the first time, Josephine discovered yet another dimension of the love growing between them. Owen's touch was both reverent and passionate, his whispered endearments making her feel cherished and desired in equal measure. After, as they lay entwined beneath the new quilt, Josephine rested her head on Owen's chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. I never thought I'd feel this way again, she confessed. Complete. Owen's arms tightened around her. Nor did I. It's a gift, Josephine, one I promise to treasure every day. Spring flowed into summer, and their life together settled into a rhythm of shared work and shared joy. They divided their time between Owen's ranch and Josephine's farm, making improvements to both properties. With Owen's knowledge of cattle and Josephine's skill with crops, they created a complementary operation that soon became one of the most successful in the county. In July, as they sat on the porch of their ranch house watching a spectacular sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Josephine turned to her husband with news she'd been saving for the right moment. Owen, she said, taking his hand in hers, I have something to tell you. He looked at her with the attentiveness that still made her heart skip. What is it, love? Josephine placed his hand gently on her still flat stomach. We're going to have a baby. Come winter, there will be 3 of us. The wonder that spread across Owen's face was everything she'd hoped for. A baby, you're certain? She nodded, her own joy reflected in his eyes. Dr. Wilson confirmed it yesterday when I was in town. Owen gathered her carefully into his arms as if she had suddenly become fragile, though they both knew she was anything but. A child, he whispered against her hair. Our child. The months that followed were filled with preparations and anticipation. They decided to make the ranch their primary home, with its larger rooms and proximity to town, but Josephine insisted on keeping her farm as well, particularly the orchard she had started in the spring. Our children should know both places, she said as they worked together to prepare a nursery in what had once been a spare bedroom. They should understand the legacy of both our efforts. Owen, hanging curtains at the window, smiled at her use of the plural. Children, is it? Planning quite a family, are we? Josephine rubbed her growing belly, now prominent beneath her apron. At least 2, maybe more if this one doesn't prove too troublesome. As winter approached, once more so different from the winter, a year before, Josephine found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her to this point. The hay that Owen had delivered that day, the supper she'd offered in exchange, the conversations by firelight that had slowly rebuilt her heart. December brought heavy snow and the approach of her confinement. Dr. Wilson had advised her to stay close to home in the final weeks, so Owen handled most of the outdoor chores, coming in periodically to check on her and warm himself by the fire. On the evening of the winter solstice, the longest night of the year, Josephine felt the first pains begin. By midnight, there was no doubt that their child was ready to enter the world. Owen rode through the snow to fetch the doctor and Mrs. Peterson, who had offered to assist with the birth. The labor was long but uncomplicated. As dawn broke on the shortest day of the year, their son was born, a robust boy with a shock of dark hair and his father's clear blue eyes. James Thomas Keller, Josephine said softly, cradling the newborn against her breast. They had decided to honor both their pasts in their child's name, James for Owen's father, Thomas for Josephine's first husband. Owen, sitting on the edge of the bed, touched his son's tiny hand with a finger that seemed enormous by comparison. "He's perfect," he said, his voice rough with emotion. Mrs. Peterson, bustling around the room with practiced efficiency, paused to smile at the new family. "A fine boy and good timing too. Born on the solstice, folks say that's a sign of a special destiny." Owen looked at Josephine, love and wonder mingling in his gaze. "He already has a special destiny. He's the son of the strongest, most beautiful woman in Montana Territory." Josephine smiled tiredly, the exhaustion of labor giving way to profound contentment. "And the most devoted, honorable man. He'll have the best of both of us." That winter, so different from the one before, passed in a blur of midnight feedings, first smiles, and the countless small miracles of new parenthood. Jamie, as they came to call him, thrived under their care, growing stronger and more alert with each passing day. By spring, when they celebrated their first wedding anniversary, Josephine could hardly remember the woman she had been alone, facing the winter with dread, uncertain of her ability to maintain the farm or even herself. That woman seemed like a distant relative, someone she had known once but whose fears and doubts now felt foreign. On a warm day in May, they took Jamie for his first visit to Josephine's original farm. The apple trees she had planted were in full bloom, their fragrance filling the air with sweet promise. Owen spread a blanket beneath the largest tree and they sat together, watching their son kick his legs enthusiastically at the dappled sunlight filtering through the blossoms. "I was so afraid that day when you first came with the hay," Josephine admitted, leaning against Owen's shoulder. "Afraid of the winter, afraid of failing, afraid of being alone." Owen's arm tightened around her. "And I was nervous as a schoolboy, wondering if you'd even let me help, let alone stay for supper." She laughed at the memory. "You didn't seem nervous. You seemed solid, like someone who knew exactly what needed doing and wasn't afraid to do it." "That's the secret of the West," Owen said, his gaze drifting over the land they both loved. "Everyone's just figuring it out as they go, trying to be brave enough for whatever comes next." Josephine looked at their son, now drowsing in the warm afternoon sun, and then at her husband, whose love had given her a second chance at happiness. "And sometimes what comes next is more beautiful than anything you could have imagined." Owen's kiss was tender, a reaffirmation of the vows they had made and the life they were building. "Always," he agreed, "especially when you face it together." As they gathered up their sleeping son and prepared to return to the ranch, Josephine took one last look at the small farmhouse where she had once faced a winter alone. It would always be part of her story, but it was no longer the whole story. Now, it was simply one chapter in a tale that continued to unfold, season by season, year by year, with the man who had brought hay and stayed for supper and for a lifetime. When Jamie was 3, they welcomed a daughter, Elizabeth Rose, a fair-haired child with her mother's determination and her father's gentle heart. 2 years later, another son joined their family, Michael Owen, completing their circle. By then, their dual properties had expanded into one of the most prosperous operations in the county, with orchards and cattle, crops, and a small dairy. They employed several hands and had built a larger home to accommodate their growing family, though they maintained the original buildings on both properties as tangible reminders of where they had begun. On winter evenings, when the children were tucked into bed and the house was quiet save for the crackling of the fire, Owen and Josephine would often sit together, her head on his shoulder, his arm around her waist, and marvel at the journey that had brought them to this place of profound contentment. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if Mr. Peterson hadn't mentioned my need for hay that day?" Josephine asked once. Owen considered the question seriously. "I'd like to think we would have found each other anyway. Some things are meant to be, Josephine." She smiled, thinking of the lonely widow she had once been and the fulfilled woman she had become. "Yes," she agreed, turning to kiss him with all the love in her heart. "Some things are definitely meant to be." And outside, the Montana winter raged on, but within the walls of their home, there was only warmth and family and love enough to last a lifetime.